more with him than this. And most of the time, almost everything I show you in this session, in this term, you're not going to need to know the dates of the objects. You're going to know around when they were, and you're going to need to know the style. But I don't care that you know the date that something was designed. You will have to know who designed it for many of the things we're looking at. Another very important, James Renwick did a lot of public buildings. And St. Patrick's was built around that time. And what you need to know, or what you should be interested in knowing, is New York at this time was, St. Patrick's was really pretty much the middle of nowhere. Everybody who was anyone lived further down, a lot of them on Fifth Avenue. But this was pretty far up. If you recall, St. Patrick's is right across the street from Rockefeller Center. Rockefeller Center, until that space was being assembled, it was owned by Columbia University until the ground was being assembled by the Rockefellers, who leased it from Columbia. That was bars and strip joints and speakeasies in the early 20s. So this was by itself, gradually New York moved uptown. And just another interior. Someone asked this afternoon, you have the advantage of coming second, so some particularly interesting questions that the afternoon class asks, I'll pass on to you. Someone says, how am I going to know the difference between Gothic and Gothic Revival? I might not be asking you that. I probably am not going to ask you, but in general, the revival styles aren't exactly copying. They're taking the motifs of the original style and generally simplifying them. You're talking about at least a century later. This is not nearly as elaborately detailed as any of the original Gothic cathedrals that you will have seen. But you recognize the motifs. And nowadays, something that I forgot to mention to them, the flying buttresses, if they're there, are only decorative. Nobody needs flying buttresses. You have different kind of construction now. One of the few Gothic, relatively few Gothic residences in America. Gothic wasn't a big deal in America. For religious buildings, yes, we didn't take to it that much, partly because, remember, the Gothic revival in England was moral, was a philosophy. Here, it was a matter of, you know, if somebody liked the style. So Alexander Jackson Davis was an architect who wrote books on adapting the English cottage, country cottage style to America. This was not country cottage. This was something that the owner wanted. I'm using it, just showing you a floor plan just to indicate this is not totally symmetrical. It does kind of resemble the form that we saw in cathedrals, although it's not deliberately planned that way. And this is what it looks like. It's in Tarrytown, which is what, about 45 minutes north of here, and it's open to the public. This is I'm not sure who owns it, you know, one of the trusts own it. This is what it looks like. So the coffered ceiling, I'm sorry, not coffered ceiling, the ceiling done with pointed arches. This is a very famous chair that Davis designed. And what you will see in any Gothic revival furniture is the elements taken from the style. Now, you look carefully at Gothic revival English and Gothic revival American, it's not going to look that different. You know, you will see the elements that are drawn from church architecture. This isn't quite as somber looking as it looks in the image. I don't recall the walls come out more reddish in the photograph. This is the dining room. Rather formal and proper. You tended to use Gothic, if you were mixing the styles, you use Gothic in the dining room or in the library. And here another very pretty, delicate chair. An original piece, that's another thing, an original Gothic era piece would have been probably made for the church, most of them, and heavier looking. This table is the same kind of thing Pugin would have designed in England. It's a very graceful chair by Davis, but you still see the elements of the arch and sort of, you know, one piece of a quatrefoil motif. J&J Meeks is one of the names I'm giving you. Well, I will be posting the vocabulary, which is really a list of names in some important places. Meeks is one of the manufacturers of the time, not original designers so much as, you know, a company like a furniture manufacturer that's producing various styles through the century. So with most of these companies that I mentioned, and I'll mention a few of them, you won't necessarily associate them with only one style. This might be, they would do Gothic and Renaissance for as long as they existed. This is a rather elaborate chair, but this is a chair made for domestic use. One of the ways you see it's a later piece, they started putting casters on a lot of the chairs. You would sit this on heavy carpet, it would roll more easily. I'll show you also some images of houses so that we know what's happening to the architecture around the time. You'll see elements, what we call gingerbread houses, have the cutout wood design, the cutout wood decorative motifs that I mentioned. I think I mentioned it last week. You could cut this out with machinery. So it was fairly inexpensive, and just slap it onto the exterior of the house. Renaissance Revival was the next style that came in, distinguished by Renaissance